On a summer morning in 1899, in a New York tenement kitchen, a mother lifts a jug of milk to her nose before she dares give it to her child. She bought this milk yesterday. It has already turned. She will pour it away, count the coins left in the tin, and go down 4 flights of stairs to buy more, because in her world, milk does not last a day. She isn't careless. She isn't poor at housekeeping. She is living in a world without refrigeration, and in that world, the most dangerous room in the house is the kitchen. Open your refrigerator today and you'll hear a soft hum, feel a wall of cold air, and see food that has waited patiently for you for days. Almost nobody thinks about it, but for nearly all of human history, that quiet cold was impossible, which raises a question most of us have never once asked. Before refrigerators existed, how did people keep their food from killing them? The problem begins the moment food is created. Milk starts to sour within hours in warm weather. Fresh meat becomes unsafe in about a day of summer heat. Fish spoils faster still. Butter melts and goes rancid. Every family on Earth, every single day, was in a quiet race against decay. And for thousands of years, the main weapons in that race were not machines. They were salt, smoke, earth, and human labor. Salt drew the moisture out of meat and fish so bacteria couldn't thrive, and barrels of salt pork carried sailors across oceans and farm families through winters. Smoke dried hams and sausages while coating them in compounds that pushed decay away. Fruit was dried in the sun. Cabbage was buried in brine and became sauerkraut. Milk was turned deliberately into cheese, cucumbers into pickles. Decay itself tamed and redirected before it could turn dangerous.
Much of what we now call flavor began as survival. The other great ally was the earth itself. Farm families dug root cellars, dark rooms held at a cool, steady temperature by the ground, where potatoes, apples, and preserves could sleep through winter. Those lucky enough to have a cold spring on their land built a springhouse over it, a small stone hut where crocks of milk and butter stood in the flowing water. These methods were clever, and within their limits they worked, but they had one hard boundary. They could slow decay, they could not stop it. Nothing truly fresh could be kept truly fresh. Unless, of course, you had ice. And ice, for most of history, belonged to the powerful. Ancient Persian engineers built the yakchal, towering mud brick domes that stored winter ice deep into the desert summer. Roman elites paid for snow hauled down from the mountains in insulated carts. On grand European estates, servants packed brick-lined ice pits each winter so their masters could chill wine in July. For an ordinary family, ice in summer was as unreachable as the moon. Then, in 1806, a young Boston merchant decided to sell the moon. His name was Frederic Tudor, and his idea sounded like a joke. He would cut ice from New England ponds, load it into a ship, and sell it in the Caribbean. Boston newspapers openly laughed at him. When his first cargo reached the island of Martinique, much of it melted at the dock because no one there had ever needed to store ice, and Tudor lost a fortune. Over the following years, he failed again and spent time in debtor's prison. Most men would have stopped. Tudor instead studied the enemy. He learned that sawdust, a waste product piling up outside New England sawmills.
He built insulated ice houses in the ports where his ships landed, and slowly, impossibly, the ice began to survive the journey. Then one of his suppliers changed everything. In the 1820s, a man named Nathaniel Wyeth built a horse-drawn cutter that scored a frozen pond into a neat grid, so crews could split the ice into uniform blocks. The harvest became fast, cheap, and industrial. In 1833, Tudor's ice sailed a third of the way around the world and landed, still frozen, in Calcutta. India had never seen anything like it, and the trade made him rich. The man Boston had mocked was now called the Ice King. And so America began to farm winter itself. Every January, when the ponds and rivers froze thick, crews of farmers and laborers walked out onto the ice with saws, chisels, and horse teams. They scraped away the snow, scored the surface into squares, and cut free blocks weighing 100 pounds or more, floating them down open channels of black water toward the shore. It was brutal work. Men soaked to the waist in freezing water, horses that slipped through the ice and had to be hauled out before they drowned, saws with teeth like sharks working inches from numb hands. Even Walden Pond was harvested, and Henry David Thoreau watched the crews from his cabin, marveling that people in Bombay and Calcutta would soon drink from his pond. The blocks were stacked inside enormous wooden ice houses along the Hudson River and the Kennebec in Maine, buried in sawdust,
tens of thousands of tons in a single building, waiting for summer. By the 1880s,
That crop flowed into the cities and into a new object at the heart of the American kitchen, the icebox, a wooden cabinet lined with metal, insulated with cork or sawdust, with a compartment at the top for a block of ice. And with the icebox came a new figure on every city street, the iceman. Families put a printed card in the window, 25, 50, 75, 100, telling him how many pounds to bring. He gripped the block with iron tongs, swung it onto a leather pad on his shoulder, and carried it up flight after flight of tenement stairs, dripping all the way. Behind his wagon, on hot days, children gathered like gulls, begging for slivers of ice, the closest thing their street had to a cold treat. But here is what the icebox actually was. Inside, on a good day, it was about as cool as a cellar, not truly cold. Milk still turned within a couple of days. Meat still couldn't wait long. The melting block dripped into a pan under the cabinet, and emptying that pan, without flooding the kitchen floor, became one of the most cursed chores in the house. Housewives still shopped for perishables almost every day. The icebox didn't end the race against decay, it only slowed the clock. And the whole system rested on something nobody could control: winter. In 1890 and again in 1906, warm winters swept the eastern United States, and the ice simply failed to grow. Newspapers called it an ice famine. Prices soared, dealers rationed deliveries, and families watched food spoil in the heat while merchants guarded their dwindling stacks. At the same time, a more disturbing problem was surfacing. The rivers the ice came from were also where growing cities dumped their sewage.
health officials began to warn that the sparkling block in the icebox, cut from the Hudson, might carry typhoid. The miracle was starting to look dirty. And decay was never just an inconvenience. In the summers of the great 19th century cities, it was a killer, and its smallest victims were babies. Every July and August, doctors braced for what they called the summer complaint, waves of deadly infant diarrhea driven in large part by spoiled and contaminated milk. In the 1850s, journalists in New York exposed the swill milk trade, thin, bluish milk drawn from diseased cows kept beside distilleries and fed on hot waste mash, then sold as pure country milk to city mothers. Milk that could not be kept cold was milk that could not be trusted, and thousands of families paid the price. It would take clean dairies, pasteurization, and cold, real cold, to change that arithmetic. The strange thing is that the answer already existed. It had been sitting in patent offices for decades. As early as 1834, an American engineer in London named Jacob Perkins patented a machine that made cold mechanically by compressing a vapor, letting it expand, and forcing it to absorb heat, the same cycle humming in your kitchen right now. Almost no one cared. In the 1840s, a Florida physician named John Gorrie built an ice-making machine for a heartbreaking reason. In Apalachicola, he was watching yellow fever patients burn with fever through the Gulf summer, and he wanted to cool their rooms. He patented his machine in 1851, and for his trouble he was ridiculed in the press, as if manufacturing ice were an affront to nature, and quietly opposed by those who profited from natural ice. He found no backers, and he died a few years later, poor and almost forgotten, decades ahead of his time.
Machine-made cold finally proved itself not in homes but in industry. In the 1870s, the German engineer Carl von Linde built reliable ammonia refrigeration machines, and breweries, which needed steady cold to make lager, became some of the first true believers. Then came meat. In the late 1870s, the Chicago packer Gustavus Swift had engineer Andrew Chase design an ice-cooled railcar, and suddenly dressed beef could travel from Chicago to New York without walking there first. Railroads fought it because they made money hauling live cattle. Local butchers fought it. Customers eyed meat slaughtered 1,000 miles away with deep suspicion. And then falling prices won the argument, the way falling prices usually do. The American diet began to change before the American kitchen did. The home was the last frontier, and the first household machines arrived like nervous guests. An electric unit called the Dommelrare appeared in Chicago in 1913. Kelvinator and Frigidaire followed after the First World War. In 1927, General Electric released the machine that finally broke through, the monitor top, with its compressor perched on the cabinet like a little steel crown. There was just one problem with the early refrigerator. It cost several $100s, more than a brand new Ford Model T. The machine, built to serve every family, began its life as a rich family's trophy. And there was a darker problem. The gases inside those early machines, ammonia, sulfur dioxide, methyl chloride, were poisonous. When seals failed and the gas leaked at night, it could kill. And in the 1920s, newspapers carried reports of families who had gone to sleep beside their new refrigerator and never woken up.
The machine that guarded the food had to stop threatening the family.
In 1930, a chemist named Thomas Midgley Jr. unveiled the answer, a new synthetic gas called Freon. To prove it was safe, he stood before the American Chemical Society, inhaled a lungful of it, and gently blew out a candle. Non-toxic, non-flammable. The last obstacle seemed to fall. Through the 1930s, prices dropped and the white box spread into perhaps 8% of American homes at the start of the decade, over 40% by 1940, and the vast majority by mid-century. But notice who was still waiting. Vast stretches of rural America had no electricity at all until government programs began stringing wires to the farms in the late 1930s and 1940s. In farm kitchens and poor neighborhoods, the iceman kept climbing stairs well into the 1950s, until one day the ice cards came out of the windows for the last time. The great ice houses on the Hudson stood empty, and a whole world of winter labor melted out of living memory. What the refrigerator changed next was almost everything about how we eat. Fresh milk that lasted days instead of hours, meat and vegetables in any season, leftovers that became a plan instead of a gamble. The daily march to the market became a weekly trip, and that single change helped make the supermarket, the frozen dinner, and the modern food system possible. It handed back, mostly to women, countless hours once spent racing decay. And it saved lives, quietly, in the least dramatic way imaginable, by making an ordinary glass of milk boring and safe. But progress kept one last secret. Freon, the miracle gas, drifted up from 100 million machines into the high atmosphere, and in 1985, scientists announced what it had done there. It was eating the ozone layer that shields the Earth from the sun.
Within 2 years, the nations of the world signed the Montreal Protocol and began phasing it out, and the refrigerator was quietly re-engineered yet again. The machine that saved our food had scarred the sky, and then, remarkably, humanity fixed that too. So tonight, when you open that door and the cold light spills out, listen to the hum for a moment. That sound is a frozen river in Maine and a horse straining on black ice. It's a merchant laughed out of Boston and a doctor in a fever ward who died too soon to be thanked. It's an iceman's soaked shoulder on the 4th floor landing and a mother who no longer has to smell the milk before she trusts it. For thousands of years, keeping food alive was a daily battle fought by hand. Now it's a background noise. And perhaps that is the greatest luxury of the modern world, that its most astonishing victories are the ones we never have to think about at all.